Hi there. This is the second video in a series on setting up a center of excellence, in this case for Anaplan. And in today's video, I'd like to talk about two big areas which are usually part of a center of excellence. I'm going to leave aside the processes that are related to business partnering. So I'm actually going to talk about the real working base of a center of excellence. So in the previous video, you already gave a thought where you see Anaplan in your organization, whether it's an IT asset or a business asset. And the next thing to think of should be the areas that you want to cover off first. And just like with any kind of work, there is more interesting side of the coin and, of course, more routine side of things. So let's have a look at those. So there are two key areas that you can call it either project work versus the support work, or growth versus operations. And for simplicity's sake, I propose we use the latter. Just as a disclaimer, I'd like to point out that this is not a full and complete list of all the processes that you should have in your center of excellence. I'm just showing them here to give you an understanding of what each area is and what's the difference between them. So in your center of excellence, you need to make sure that there are people and processes who enable you to deliver major changes. Major changes, that's usually something that is quite big in terms of functionality. This can be 1/3 or 1/4 of a model. And same thing goes for proof of concepts. Very often that's when people see, departments see that you can deliver such a thing with Anaplan. Okay, and this sometimes may take more than major changes. Okay, and new models, that's another thing. That's a completely new case. Very often that's like a separate project where you actually deliver such a new model. Sometimes this is coming out of the proof of concepts. Okay, the rollout, I explained in the previous video that there are cases when you can have one development model and several production models, like in different areas, but they are contained to their own model for different reasons. Security can be one of them, performance can be one of them, and so on and so on. Okay, and business analysis. Now there must be someone, and this can be even outside a center of excellence of yours, who would be doing a business analysis. I've seen different approaches where a person that is doing the modeling job also working as a business analyst. This does work, especially when you have a business asset kind of approach. I also have seen when BAs, business analysts, they cannot really sit on two chairs at the same time due to different reasons, either technical or analytical. So you might have the technically savvy guys who are not very good business analysts and the other way around. So this would be like just a hint of the processes that you should have as part of the growth area of your center of excellence. Now, talking about operations, usually we talk about the people who address different issues, fixing bugs. Now, software development, there are always bugs. Sometimes they are miscategorized, those can be changes. Okay, it's a separate debate that you might need to have. But again, you need to make sure that there is a process on fixing bugs. And I mean, you can have SLAs, which is very formal, which is more kind of an IT asset approach, or you can have the business guys, no SLAs that they would be following. I mean, you can try to make them, but that's probably not going to work out that well. Okay, you need to make sure that people are there to set up access. And again, this is not only execution, but how actually this kind of work gets delivered for them for execution. So you might need to have an ITSM system, IT service management, and ticketing, the approval process, and so on and so on. You need to make sure that there are people and processes that allow provision of different kinds of services. Okay, that doesn't really boil out only to access. Sometimes you need to trigger things. Sometimes there's a certain schedule to do. You need to prepare a model for the next financial year, for example. This can be a very long activity in terms of execution. So different kind of things, and changes they actually can be part of this. All right, it depends on how you're going to set up your ways of working. So small changes definitely you can throw in there. Medium and major, sometimes you can do that as well. Again, depends on what your organization is trying to achieve here in terms of the setup. Okay, the controls. In the previous video, I mentioned that the bigger your company is, and if it's a publicly traded company, you usually need to follow certain sets of measures aimed at eliminating different kinds of risks. And there is a bunch of controls that you need to execute. And like this is probably one of the very unlikely things that business guys usually would execute. It just take them too much time and really a routine kind of work. So that's also sits in the basket with the operations and the oops, fix that. So licenses, you need to make sure that you do not exceed your allowance in terms of the number of licenses that you have purchased from the company. So again, this is not a full and complete list, but just to give you a hint, this is more routine kind of work. All right. And the above usually is kind of a more interesting, more well, closer to business, so to say, and more interesting kind of work to execute. And I've been in both areas for a significant time, at least a couple of years. And I know that both are equally important, and sometimes one can be a source for resources. We'll talk about resources in a separate video. But again, this is just to give you a hint of what I mean by those two different areas. So depending on the approach that you have chosen, whether it's a business asset or an IT asset, you need to think of who is going to cover the growth part of things and the operations. Again, this can be a single person if your set of processes that you need right now is, I call it edible, right? We might not need to follow the controls framework. The number of licenses, you might not have that many. The access, okay, you only have 5 to 10 people. Okay, this is fine. So this case, business has kind of an approach. You might need to find someone who will be doing this growth part. Maybe you want to throw a person into the business analysis, or maybe it was a person who has done this already as part of the project, and give them the admin access for developing new models. Or you can give a task of delivering a proof of concept. I mean, this can be a very interesting thing for a person to deliver from start to end. Okay, new models, well, probably you will get there a bit later. You need to, bring up those resources. Okay, rollouts, that's also possible, right? It's not usually complicated. Actually, it might be even very useful when you have a model, you give it to a person and he needs or she needs to roll it out to a new region, for example. You need the documentation for that and the processes that person might need. I mean, that document can be created. So this is more interesting kind of work, and I am more inclined to recommend giving this to business analysts or basically people from business, because this is just more interesting. They can deliver innovation to your organization with the changes that they have in mind, or maybe they already have something that they would like to deliver next. Okay, so if it's a business asset approach for you, maybe it makes sense to throw in the business guys into the growth area. Now, what are you going to do with the operations? So you have two approaches here, right? You might have this in-house, find a person for that. You might have somebody external, maybe it's still that business partner, which is probably quite costly. And if you want to avoid those costs, that's probably the case where you want to insource that kind of work. Now, the third approach is find a different external party that doesn't take as much for the same kind of work, because the guys who deliver the growth are usually more expensive. So these are the ways you can address them. And the fourth approach, I mean, you can still give everything that you have from the operations to that same poor guy who will be working on growth, granted that the number of things that you expect from that person is edible, right? Realizable. So that's how I would suggest to do this with the IT, business asset kind of an approach. However, do bear in mind that people who are from business very likely will come back to you in some time and say, okay, I don't want to do any of this. Please do something about it. And again, you'll either need to have someone in-house to execute this. And this can be a good source of Anaplan modeling resources for growth later. Talk about resources in the next video. But also you can then try to find someone external who would do this thing for you. Okay, so that's the business asset kind of approach. Now, if you have an IT asset approach and the number of processes, models, operations is significant, I would propose to think of starting out with the operations. Okay, you need to make sure that people are there with the SLAs, fixing things on time, and the processes are established from the start. Because when you need to reteach people on how to work with certain technology, so imagine you have a model in Anaplan already and people love it. When you try to impose new processes which are somehow connected to discipline, okay, previously I could get access from the person, I would just ping the person and ask for it. If you have an ITSM system with the approval process, that might take a bit more adjustment. So try to formalize things as soon as possible when you're trying to follow the IT asset kind of an approach, and you have time to actually make things right from the start, and cater for different processes that might come up later on. Now, I already mentioned this. Talking about resources, we'll do that later. This can be a very good source for your growth area of a center of excellence when people know how things operate here and you see that they can actually deliver small changes, medium-sized changes. Maybe they are very good candidates to actually giving them more complicated kind of work. Okay, now let's say you start off with this, and another benefit with this approach is that you have certain ways of work in your organization, very likely already, regardless whether you have Anaplan or not. You can still come back to the guys in growth and say, okay, you know what, this is the process that we would like to be executed in a different way. Yes, the business result is exactly the same, but that's not how we do that in our organization. So this is the time when you can think about data quality. If the project doesn't dedicate certain amount of resources, which is enough, okay. Now there can be questions on documenting, okay. So you might come back to them and say, okay guys, you need a document on preparing the model for the next financial year. That's not there. So different kinds of criteria that you can still come back to and ask them to execute this, not afterwards when the project is over and you have to pick it up and do it all on your own and reteach people when you actually have to address different kind of bugs, incidents, and so on and so on. Try to push this into the project phase as much as possible. Ideally, they should be the ones who should think of those criteria. So just to summarize, the two areas that we have covered here, the growth area and the operations area, the more interesting and the more routine sides of the coin, those are the areas that need to be addressed. Again, you might not be thinking about some of the processes because they are done ad hoc. The number of things that you need to execute is very small. That's why you're not even thinking about them. But depending on how you see the Anaplan managed in your organization, whether it's an IT asset or a business kind of asset, you might have different approaches on covering these two areas. Okay, so this would be general recommendations on two different areas depending on the approach, and please adapt these recommendations to your own case, because every set of givens is different. You can have different number of models, you can have different quality and number of resources, you can have different demands and controls to operate, for example. So do use this in a most non-prescriptive way, and hopefully this will aid you in setting up a CoE of your own. I'll see you in the next video where we'll talk about the resources